Thank you very much for allowing me to talk to you today about short bowel syndrome and intestinal failure. Thank you to IFFGD for inviting me. This is going to be just a broad overview of intestinal failure, which includes short bowel syndrome. The biggest thing to know about intestinal failure and short bowel syndrome is that the intestine is a very unique organ. Different parts are responsible for doing different things. And depending on which part of the intestine is potentially impacted will depend on what sort of problems you might have associated with the intestine or short bowel syndrome. And just to keep in mind, a general overview of the digestive system is as things travel through the GI system, they go to the esophagus, stomach, duodenum, which is part of the small intestine, jejunum again, which is part of the small intestine, and ileum, part of the small intestine as well. And then they finally go into the colon. So this is an overview or a map of the intestinal system. And it shows what areas of the small intestine in particular are responsible for absorbing and maintaining your health. So as I eat something, it travels through the esophagus, through the stomach, into the small intestine. The duodenum is the first part. That's primarily responsible for absorbing heavy metals, things such as iron, copper, magnesium. Then it travels down into the jejunum, where sugars and proteins are starting to be absorbed, and then finally reaches the ileum, where things like fat and fat-soluble vitamins are absorbed. The very last part of the small intestine, called the terminal ileum, has a very unique role in absorption of a certain vitamin called vitamin B12, bile, and even more fat. The stomach and the colon don't really absorb a whole lot. The colon mainly absorbs certain fats, but mostly water, and water is absorbed throughout. So intestinal failure is a broad umbrella term, meaning the intestine is not absorbing what it needs to in order for you to maintain your health. Short bowel syndrome is a term under intestinal failure that means part of the intestine has been removed. And part of that intestine that has been removed causes you to have nutrition issues. And just like this real estate map shows, what part of the intestine is, it really depends what part of the intestine is removed in terms of what sort of health issues you might have. So intestinal failure, by definition, is when the body is unable to absorb enough fluid or nutrients to stay healthy. Many different causes of intestinal failure, short bowel syndrome being one of them. But really, when you talk about intestinal failure, there's two groups of things that could potentially happen. One is having a medical condition that leads to problems with absorption of either fluid and or nutrients. And then the other is a surgical condition where surgery leads you to have these issues. Under the medical condition umbrella, there are many things that can cause the intestine to fail. I've listed several of them here. There's more in your packet, but in general, there's either anatomical issues, flow issues, or issues with the tissue itself. So anatomically, you can have blockages or obstruction. Things like tumors can block flow through the intestine, scarred tissue. You can have congenital disorders like Hirschsprung's disease, so on and so forth. Cancer, beyond tumors, can also cause issues with intestinal absorption. If you've had radiation, sometimes radiation can damage the intestine. Other cancers can cause proteins to build up in the intestine, such as amyloid, which block nutrients and fluids from being absorbed into the intestine. Beyond that, you can have issues with flow, or what we call motility, through the GI system. People whose stomachs don't work, that's called gastroparesis, they can eat, but the food doesn't travel past their stomach, so they get problems with pain and things like that. You can't maintain your nutrition like that. Even though the rest of your intestine works, you can't get food through the stomach to get to the rest of the intestine where things get absorbed. There's other issues with pseudo-obstruction. People with systemic sclerosis, which was formerly called scleroderma, and things like that can also have flow or motility issues, which cause you not to be able to take in enough fluid or nutrients. When you have issues with the actual tissue itself, like inflammation caused by Crohn's disease or problems with blood flow to the tissue itself, You can get food and fluid to the areas of the intestine that they need to go, but the tissue itself is so damaged that it can't grab onto the nutrients and then absorb it into the body. So all of these things are medical conditions leading to problems getting enough fluid or nutrients into the body. Now, surgery is a unique thing in terms of it causing problems with fluid and nutrient absorption. Typically, the causes of intestinal failure from surgery are due to removing extensive portions of the small intestine and or stomach. So when a surgeon goes in and removes parts of the intestine for whatever reason, could be Crohn's disease, could be cancer, could be ischemia, problems with blood flow, you're left with a shorter area of intestine that's responsible for absorbing, and that absorptive capacity or that area of the intestine that is left behind just really isn't big enough in order to absorb as much fluid or nutrition as it needs to. Put it another way, your small intestine, which again is responsible for most of the absorption, is about 15 or 20 feet long. That's a lot of surface area to absorb a bunch of stuff. And if you sliced open the small intestine, laid it out flat, all these peaks and valleys, which are called villi in the small intestine, you laid those flat as well, it would be somewhere in between the size of a tennis court to a football field. Now, if you start removing big chunks of that, you can imagine that all of that surface that's normally used to absorb fluids and nutrients is taken away. And when food and liquids flow through the intestine, you might not be able to absorb as much as you need to in order to survive. And that's called short bowel syndrome. The other cause surgically of intestinal failure is when somebody has an ostomy or part of the small intestine or a colon is brought out to the skin, and instead of emptying when you sit down and go to the bathroom to have a bowel movement, it empties into a bag on the belly. That's fine in and of itself, but sometimes people can empty too much. That bag or that ostomy leads to rapid flow of contents through the intestinal system, and it flows through so rapidly you just can't absorb enough. So that's called high ostomy output. That's another reason people could have intestinal failure. So what do you do about it? When you have intestinal failure, things such as short bowel syndrome or the other things that we just talked about, how do you treat that? How do you fix that? The main thing you need, in my opinion, is a strong medical team around you. This diagram came from an article published 7 or 8 years ago that goes into detail about what sort of team you need if you have intestinal failure. You need somebody who's going to be your quarterback, who's going to oversee your medical treatment. In this example, this is a gastroenterologist, but it could be a surgeon, it could be a primary care provider, somebody else, but somebody who's going to oversee everything and make sure that you get the treatment that you need. Everybody with intestinal failure is a little bit different. There's no two people alike who have intestinal failure, mainly because there's so many different things that come into play when you have intestinal failure. So when you have intestinal failure, you need a team around you, and you need a multidisciplinary team, not only your quarterback, but also people like dietitians, pharmacists, radiologists. Sometimes you need a nurse or an infectious disease provider, other people who can help oversee your care and contribute when bumps in the road happen. Because when people have intestinal failure, bumps in the road do happen, and that's okay. But you need an individualized treatment plan, and you need a medical team surrounding you. So this diagram is a useful tool to look at and show your team just to make sure you have everybody you need. So with your team surrounding you, and that's easier said than done, but with putting together a team, there are a number of different steps that we go through in order to make sure people with intestinal failure get the treatment that they need in order to maintain their nutrition and hydration, their health. Step one, first thing is hydration. You need to stay hydrated. Hydration is the thing that is going to injure you or potentially kill you the fastest. If you're dehydrated, you're going to have problems with your organs, mainly kidneys, but other organs can be involved. And if you are dehydrated for long enough, your kidneys can shut down, and that can be significant to your health and could even cause death. So hydration is the most important treatment to think about. So things like drinking enough fluids, and the fluids that we tell people to drink are non-caffeinated, without artificial sweeteners or things like that. Caffeine is a diuretic. Artificial sweeteners move through the system very quickly. And we ask people to eat first and then drink. Your dietitian, your gastroenterologist, primary care, they can design a drink menu for you, which includes both liquids as well as different amounts of fluid that you need to drink every day. Step 2 is eating. Not everybody can eat by mouth. Some people have tubes, some people get fluids and nutrition through an IV, things like that. But you need to maintain your nutrition. After your hydration is taken care of, nutrition is next. You need, if you can eat, small frequent meals, snacks, those are great because you don't want to overwhelm the system all at once. You want to keep the system going at a regular rate. If you have a feeding tube, that's certainly fine. You need to design a feeding tube plan with your dietitian or physician or. And then finally, if you need IV nutrition, that's called TPN, we manage that as well. The third thing in terms of treatment that you need to have in mind is medication. There are a ton of different medications that we can use to help with absorption, fluid balance, things like that. People use acid blockers, not for heartburn necessarily, but to reduce the amount of fluid that your stomach and small intestine produces. We use medications to slow down the intestine, things like loperamide, diphenoxylate, opium tincture, and codeine. That's to slow things down so that the intestine has the ability to absorb better. The slower things move, the more time there is to absorb. And then finally, we have hormones that we can use, things like octreotide or teduglutide. Those not only help with absorption, but they can actually increase the number of cells that are available to absorb things. They don't necessarily elongate the intestine, but they cause all those cells to grow and divide, which allow us to absorb and pick up nutrients. So this is just a general overview of intestinal failure. Please look at your packet for more information and ask questions as things come up in the multidisciplinary session. Thank you very much.